respond? Thanks be to God. Perfectly. Okay. Now, Matthew chapter 13, starting in verse 1, it says, "That same day, Jesus went out to the house and sat by the lake. Such large crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and sat in it, while all the people stood on the shore. Then he told them many things in parables, saying, a farmer went out to sow his seed. As he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path, and the birds came up and ate it. Some fell on rocky places where it did not have much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow. But when the sun came up, the plants were scorched, and they withered because they had no root. Other seed fell among thorns, which grew up and choked out the plants. Still other seed fell on good soil, where it produced a crop, 100, 60, or 30 times what was sown. Whoever has ears, let them hear." This is the word of the Lord. Thank you so much. Have a seat. Okay, so I have a question to start us out. I would love to know, have you ever been in a situation where you felt uncomfortable on behalf of somebody else? Yeah? You ever felt that way? Maybe it's a situation that didn't necessarily impact you directly, but you could just feel the tension in that moment. Anybody relate to that? Right? A situation where conflict is bubbling and you just know that it's not going to go well. You've been there, right? Well, I will say that preaching through Matthew chapter 12, which we just finished last week, was a little bit like that for me. Now, for those who know me well, you know I do not prefer conflict. However, I am not afraid of it at all. Okay? I don't prefer it, but I'm not afraid of it. As a teenager, my parents would say that I was destined to be a lawyer because I could argue a dead horse back to life. I feel sorry, parents. I like to argue, as my wife knows, sometimes for the sake of arguing. So it's not the conflict itself that made me feel uncomfortable. Rather, it was what I knew these moments in chapter 12 were leading up to. It was what I knew the Pharisees were going to do as a result of the conflict that Jesus was creating. Now, ultimately, as we see in Matthew 12:14, the Pharisees had enough of Jesus, and they began in that moment, it says they began plotting how they were going to kill Jesus. In fact, this entire chapter 12, was the turning point in the story of Jesus. We see Jesus confront the Pharisees on a number of topics, okay? The topic of Sabbath, the topic of loyalty, the topic of allegiance to Jesus. He calls the Pharisees a brood of vipers, which is comparable to sons of Satan. He calls them a wicked and adulterous generation. And Jesus even challenges his mother and his brothers. So teaching through chapter 12 brought about a number of challenging topics and ideas. And for those of you who are with us for all of them, thanks for sticking with us. But the level of conflict and the level of difficult concepts that Jesus covers does not just impact us as we consume them, it changed things for Jesus as well. Now, aware of the growing conflict with the Pharisees, with the religious leaders, Jesus actually takes the opportunity to introduce a brand new teaching tool. And that tool is, at least in part, the attempt to keep the Pharisees from getting even more inflamed. So that's what we're going to see in chapter 13. In fact, today, the tool we see was mentioned in the passage. It's the tool called a parable. All right, so we are going to encounter the beginning of a series of parables that Jesus uses to teach his disciples, to teach his followers, to teach the various people who are trying to learn from him. Now, what's a parable? That's a great question. I'm glad you asked it. A parable literally means to place beside. And so, in other words, it's a teaching tool. Well, Jesus will take a common, well-known story or a practice, and he will attach it to a spiritual truth. He's giving it handles. He's trying to help them understand the deeper spiritual truth through a regular, everyday event. Now, this is the genius of Jesus, right? Jesus will use this common everyday example to impart in his listeners the important spiritual truths of the kingdom of heaven. And at the same time, those who are looking to weaponize his words will have no idea really what Jesus is talking about. we will not see the threat. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to dive into this parable, we're going to dissect it, and Jesus is eventually going to explain to his disciples the meaning of it. So let's take it kind of section by section and see what Jesus is doing with this parable. Going back to the beginning of Matthew chapter 13, I'm going to read just verses 1 and 2. We see the setting is happening. It says, that same day Jesus went out of the house, sat by the lake. It says such large crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and he sat in it while all the people stood on the shore. So we see that the setting is highlighting that Jesus is teaching to a very large crowd, right? He's teaching to such a large crowd that he goes out onto a boat or onto the lake by way of a boat, which actually many of the scholars would say is partially to amplify his voice. Now, if you've ever been on a lake, then you know noise carries, right? So be careful what you say on the boat, okay, people? But in this particular example, Jesus was actually using it to his benefit. So Jesus wants the people around him to hear this teaching. This teaching is indeed meant for a broad audience. That's the setting. And then here's the parable. Verse 3, it says, then he told them many things in parables, saying, a farmer went out to sow his seed. As he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path, and the birds came up and ate it. Some fell on rocky places where it did not have much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow. But when the sun came up, the plants were scorched and they were withered because they had no root. Other seed fell among thorns, which grew up and choked the plants. Still other seed fell on good soil where it produced a crop, 160 or 30 times what was sown. So Jesus' first parable involves the very common relatable practice, especially to people in that day, of a farmer sowing seed. This was so common that the people would have likely seen while they were listening to Jesus, a farmer on a hillside literally sowing seeds. It was like Jesus using ancient PowerPoint, okay? He's like teaching and he's like, see, yeah, exactly. There's a farmer right over there. See, this is the lesson that we're learning together. And then Jesus tells them about the 4 types of soil that the farmer scatters seed on. The first one is the path, right? It's hard. The seed cannot break ground on the pathway. And so what happens is the birds come along and they scoop up the seed. The second type is the rocky soil. I want you to think of it like a thin layer over a giant boulder. So the roots can grow well because the soil is good, but it's such a thin layer that when the sun comes up, it scorches the root system and they wither. The third type is amongst thorns. It cannot grow up, the seed cannot sprout, it cannot take root because there's other plants around it, thorny, bad plants, weeds that choke out any hope that the seed has of taking root and growing. And then finally, the fourth type of soil that Jesus mentions is the good soil. It receives the seed and it grows with exponential success. Now, at first glance, you probably are thinking what many people in that audience are thinking. Why would the farmer waste his time on the first 3 types of soil? Right? You're thinking to yourself, probably just skip the first 3, put the seed in the good soil, right? The farmer guy or the farmer gal is clearly a noob at this and needs a lot of help. But we have to remember that Jesus knows there are at least some people in the crowd who are looking for any and every reason to discredit Jesus. Therefore, they would find this teaching, this parable of the farmer, almost completely harmless and even inconsequential. Most people understand that you should not throw seed on a hard path and expect it to grow. So it seems that this teaching does not present itself as a threat to the Pharisees' power, which is one of the primary goals of Jesus as he teaches through the parable. And then at that point, Jesus hits them with this subtle but extremely important statement. Verse 9, very short, very important. He says, whoever has ears, let them hear. Whoever has ears, let them hear. This statement is not at all Jesus calling to see who's listening. Jesus isn't doing the, hey, 1, 2, 3, eyes on me, right? Remember that? That's not what he's doing. He's not asking, hey, can you hear me? What he's doing is he's telling those who have the spiritual sensitivity, who have the Spirit of God working in their life, hey, listen to this and take special notice. Take special notice because the Spirit of God is going to work a truth into your life through this parable. Now, does that mean that a person who doesn't understand the parable right away is automatically to assume that they don't have the Spirit of God working in their life? And that is just not true at all. In fact, we see in the very next section that we're about to read that Jesus' own disciples ask him for further explanation. They ask him, Jesus, what does this mean? And so what we see, and the reason for the parable, is that Jesus is using the parable to further walk away from inflaming the anger in the hearts of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. Jesus doesn't want people to be angry with him. He knows his ministry must continue for a season. So he begins using the parables. And at this point, Jesus tells his disciples the purpose behind the parables. We pick this up in 13 verse 10, reading all the way through 17. It says, the disciples came to him and asked, why do you speak to the people in parables? He replied, because the knowledge of the secrets of the kingdom of heaven have been given to you, but not to them. Whoever has will be given more, and they will have an abundance. Whoever does not have, even what they have will be taken from them. This is why I speak to them in parables. Though seeing, they do not see. Though hearing, they do not hear or understand. In them is fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah. You will be ever hearing, but never understanding. You will be ever seeing, but never perceiving. For this people's heart has become calloused. They hardly hear with their ears, and they have closed their eyes. Otherwise, they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and turn, and I would heal them. But blessed are your eyes because they see, and your ears because they hear. For truly I tell you, many prophets and righteous people longed to see what you see, but did not see it, and to hear what you hear, but did not hear it. Okay, so what's Jesus saying? Well, according to Jesus, these parables serve a dual purpose. They serve the purpose of expanding on the reality and the truth of the kingdom of heaven to those who have the ears to hear, and to limit and even restrict further understanding to those who want to oppose Jesus. And then Jesus quotes the prophet Isaiah to help clarify the purpose of the parable. Let me read this to you one more time. You will be ever hearing but never understanding. You will be ever seeing but never perceiving, for this people's heart has become calloused. They hardly hear with their ears, and they have closed their eyes. Otherwise, they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and turn, and I would heal them. So this is not a trick by Jesus. This is not a trick by God. It is a tool to help people understand, for those who love Jesus to understand what Jesus' purpose is and what the kingdom of God entails for those who are going to love Jesus and follow him. And for those whose hearts are calloused, are hard, are impenetrable by the seed, it's to simply help them not understand so that they don't become more hurt, more angry. And then Jesus finishes his explanation as to why the parables are important with this great encouragement. He says, when you hear and understand the meaning of the parable, you are blessed. That's really good news. Even the slightest understanding, even if you look at it and you go, I don't really get it, but I understand this, you are blessed. It's really good news. And so at this point, Jesus actually grants the request of the disciples, and he explains the parable in detail. So, if you're like me and you read that the first time through and you're like, I'm not a farmer, help me understand. There's some obvious things. Like I said, don't use the path. Use the fertile soil. But what is the deeper meaning behind what Jesus is trying to do? Well, let's read this rest of our section for today. Matthew 13, starting in verse 18, says this. It says, listen to what the parable of the sower means. When anyone hears the message about the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what was sown in their heart. This is the seed sown along the path. The seed falling on the rocky ground refers to someone who hears the word at once and receives it with joy. But since they have no root, they last only a short time. When trouble or persecution comes because of the word, they quickly fall away. Verse 22 says, the seed falling among the thorns refers to someone who hears the word, but the worries of life and the deceitfulness of wealth choke the word, making it unfruitful. But the seed falling on good soil refers to someone who hears the word and understands it. This is the one who produces a crop yielding 160 or 30 times what was sown. So let's look at these different types of seeds. First of all, again, you have the seed that's fallen along the path. And it's the seed that's on the hard ground, a seed to a hardened, calloused heart. It cannot take root. And when it cannot take root, any inspiration or understanding is quickly taken away by the enemy. In fact, we see in 2 Corinthians 4 a reminder of how important and true this is. 2 Corinthians 4, 3-4 says this, and even if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled to those who are perishing. The God of this age has blinded the minds of unbelievers so that they cannot see the light of the gospel that displays the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. At times, I am baffled that anyone can go through this life and reject the good news of Jesus, and reject the message of his grace, and reject the message of his mercy, reject the offer of salvation of eternity with him. But this parable reminds us that this is indeed a possibility, and that it might be more than just the reasoning of a person. It actually might be that the enemy is stealing away every ounce of hope from their heart before it can ever take root. So you might be working on somebody, you might be talking to somebody, encouraging them, and just like, how in the world can I not get through to this person? Well, it's not necessarily you. It might be you. And we can have a coffee and work on that. But I know all of you. You're wonderful. So it might be the enemy. The seed might be falling on a calloused heart. It's beyond our control. And he talks about the second seed, the seed that falls on rocky soil. Think of a large plant and a small planter, right? We've all probably seen a planter and just like a plant that's shooting up and you're like, oh, what am I going to do with this, right? Because if the roots are unable to grow in proportion to the plant, then if the plant encounters adversity, it will die because it doesn't have the root system to survive the adverse conditions. Therefore, this plant must be transferred to deeper soil, right, where the root system can grow in a way that sustains the plant. Similarly, a person who hears the gospel and immediately receives it with joy. Like, oh, that's such good news, and they understand it. It finally dawns on them that there's a Savior who will take them on despite their shortcomings. That person is now set up to find deeper soil. But if they don't, they will be like the seed that falls along the rocky ground. That if they don't continue to develop that inspiration, if they don't find a set of practices that help them learn how to grow their faith, and if they don't find a local community called the church, they fall prey to the adversity of life. At Foundation Church, we are helping people. This is why we say this. We're helping people be with Jesus, become like Jesus, and do what Jesus did. And how we are doing that is through deep work in community over a long period of time. The inspiration a person receives from the gospel may be instantaneous, but the transforming work of becoming like Jesus is lifelong. It is. It's lifelong. Becoming like Jesus is long, slow work. And it is best supported in the context of the local church. Paul reminds us in 2 Corinthians 3, he says, "And we all, who with unveiled faces contemplate the Lord's glory, are being transformed into his image with ever-increasing glory, which comes from the Lord who is Spirit." Meaningful work takes time. Meaningful transformation takes hard work. And God has given us places like the local church, a space to find the support that is needed to stay committed, to stay growing, to make sure that you're transported into deeper soil so that you're not like the plant who's in shallow soil, that the first time adversity comes, your persecution comes, you're scorched and withered. Because lacking deep roots is going to lead to that. Lacking deep roots is going to lead to that, but you do not have to lack deep roots. You do not. However, lacking deep roots is not the only way that a seed can be overcome by its surroundings. Jesus warns of another problem, the third type of seed, the seed that falls among the thorns. There is also a seed that falls among great soil. But the problem is the soil is so good that many other things are growing in that soil. And as the seed grows, so do the thorns, so do the weeds. And they end up overtaking the seed and choking it out. And Jesus gets very specific about the way the thorns work, about what represents the thorns. He says two specific things: the worries of life and the deceitfulness of wealth. The worries of life and the deceitfulness of wealth. In this example, we observe a life or a seed that has such fertile soil that many things are going really well. Think of a person who just got a big promotion, bought a great house, they found their soulmate, they got a new truck and a new boat. Sounds awesome, right? Life is soaring. But with all of these new and fun things come the worries that are attached to them. The promotion means more money, but it also means longer hours, time away from family. Buying a house can be a spectacular event, but now you have all of the headaches of being a homeowner, right? Or like a lot of head shaking right now. Maybe you finally found the person you want to marry, and they need your love and your attention, which means that the new truck and the new boat are sitting in the garage. You see, we're prone to worry. We're prone to worry about our career. We're prone to worry about our family. We're prone to worrying about our friends. We worry about money. We just simply are prone to worry. And even though it's something we all do, it's still a problem. Because Jesus says worry can choke out the work that God is doing in your life. Jesus knows this, which is why he addressed it directly in the Sermon on the Mount 7 chapters ago. In chapter 6, it says this, Matthew 6:34, "Therefore do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own." If I'm honest, I'm already worrying about Friday, not just tomorrow, right? I got to get some fillings. Who wants to do that? Nobody, right? I mean, every single one of us has something we're worrying about that's beyond right now, and Jesus is saying, don't do it. And then later he helps us understand because it will choke out what God's trying to do in your life. You might be thinking, okay, great, Pastor Rick, now I'm worried about worrying. What do you have me doing here? That's not the point. That's not why we bring it up. That's not why we teach it. The point is, worry is not the solution. It is a thorny weed. And it's choking out the good seeds that God is trying to sow in your life. Then he brings up the other weed, the deceitfulness of wealth. Now, for me, and maybe you can relate to this, generosity does more than make me feel good. Generosity does make me feel good. But it does two very important things in my life. First of all, it connects me to the things I value in a tangible way. Jesus actually tells us this in Matthew 6:21. He says, "For where your treasure is, there your heart will also be." This isn't me just saying it. Jesus is saying it. Hey, you will know what matters to you most when you evaluate how your money is being used. And the second thing it does is it gives me the ability to develop the spiritual muscle to fight off the deceitfulness of wealth. It gives me the ability to develop the spiritual muscle. When you are developing a muscle, right? It doesn't just take one repetition. It takes thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, 200 million reps, it feels like, to develop that muscle. And giving is in the same category. It's like a muscle. Generosity is like that. You give a little bit, and you give a little bit more, and you are a little bit more generous. And you start to develop that muscle. Now, as a child, you have been at one point in your life completely dependent on somebody else. All of us have started there, right? Now, we're not going to evaluate how well that other person did. That's for a different sermon. But you've been there. And then depending on your experiences, how you were raised, what you've been taught, how you think about money, you've developed one of two schools of thought. You either believe that you are your own provider, or you believe that God is your provider. All right? And there's a lot of factors in there. There's a lot of factors. And no matter how much I study, no matter how much I comprehend, no matter how much I determine to live wholeheartedly under the reality that God is my provider, I consistently feel the pull to the other side. Consistently. And I think every person who has a biblical view of money will at times struggle with this same idea, which is why it's even more important for us to exercise our generosity muscle. Because there's not just a force that is latent, there's a force that is actively working against us to put the deceitfulness of wealth in front of us, to trick us. Jesus is warning us the deceitfulness of wealth will be the very thing that chokes out potentially the seed that God is trying to sow in your life. But we have a way out. And that way out is to practice generosity. For me, the act of tithing and giving to the church or giving to other nonprofits that I believe in and just giving to those around me are all things that I do, and I do them for my benefit. Right? When you give, when God has called you to be generous to the various things he's called you to be generous to, you realize it's for your benefit, right? This is not God going, man, if I could just get Pastor Jessica to give a little bit more, then we could finally solve all of these problems. She's just so stingy. That's not what God needs. We know that. And yet at times, I know my thinking is in that camp. Even subconsciously, as I worry or believe that that amount of money could go to something that I would just love all the more, that would make my life so much happier, which my life's really great, so I don't really think that way that often. And I think a lot of you feel that way, but every once in a while there's just that thing like, oh man, a new truck would be nice, right? Man, if I could just have this, if I could just make this much, if I could just, the deceitfulness of wealth is so tricky. So God gives us the opportunity to work that out, and it's for our benefit. And here's the good news. When we fail, grace abounds. When we fail, grace abounds. So you don't have to beat yourself up. You don't. Instead, make a plan to exercise your generosity muscle and just stick with the plan. And then watch how God faithfully cares for you like a father cares for a child he loves dearly. And that brings us to the fourth seed, the seed that falls among good soil. When a seed finds good soil, the soil that is rich in nutrients, has plenty of depth for sustained growth, and has been removed of the weeds, the thorns, the worries of life, and the deceitfulness of wealth, that seed finds exponential growth. 30, 60, even 100 times its expected capacity. Wow. That's a lot of growth. That's the type of growth I want. It's the type of growth I think you want. And so what do we observe from this teaching, from this parable? I think in one sense, the parable of the sower, Jesus is illustrating how various types of people receive his teachings. And depending on the soil in that person's life, the impact varies. And this is definitely part of what the parable means from my perspective, but I also believe that in another sense, we would be wise to understand that all of us have a little bit of each soil in our own life. Right? I would love to be all good soil, but I'm not. Not yet, at least. None of us are immune to the things that create these different soil situations. But I want to say it again and remind you wholeheartedly, when we fail, grace abounds. So here's a few questions for us to consider as we go about our week, okay? Where is God sowing a seed in your life that is falling on the hard, path-like soil, and it's just finding no room to develop? Where is God sowing a seed in your life that is falling on the rocky soil, needing to be developed into that deeper soil of Christian communities, calling you maybe to do the practicing the way course, but you're like, man, Monday nights, that's my night, right? Where's God sowing a seed in your life that's falling among the thorns and it's getting choked out by the worries of life? Where's God sowing a seed in your life that's falling on the soil that's being deceived by the deceitfulness of wealth? If I'm honest, I'm uncomfortable with those two myself, the amount of things that I could put in that category. But again, grace abounds. And here's the final question to consider. How do I prepare myself to be the good soil? To be ready for the good things that God has prepared for me to accomplish? How can I do that? Now, you may or may not have an answer to one or all of these, but here's my encouragement as you consider these questions this week. First of all, I hope that you will. Second of all, I hope that you will start with prayer. That you will ask God to reveal the areas in your life where your soil is less than ideal, and ask God to grow those seeds in your life. I'm going to have the band come up. We're going to receive communion here in just a moment. We like to close our time together by remembering what God has done in our life. And what I love about communion, much like so many of the things that we see around us, God's goodness in situations around us, right? The way he has blessed us, the way he has led us out of worry and away from the deceitfulness of wealth, where seeds are really growing with great intensity. Communion is a tangible reminder of God's grace. So that's why we try to do it every Sunday, is because we want to deeply remember what Jesus did. Jesus himself said, "Do this in remembrance of me." But it's also a touchable, tasteable, consumable way of reminding yourself that God's grace is sufficient. It's such a wonderful gift that Jesus has given us. Jesus is the most generous person to have ever existed. And communion is a great way to celebrate that. So if you will stand with me, I'm going to pray for the elements in just a moment. And then you can take yourself and your family, if you're here with somebody else, and walk back. Grab in our context, juice and a cracker. Bring them back to your seat. Receive them by yourself. Receive them with your family. But here's the thing. To the non-Christ follower, to the person who doesn't follow Jesus, this is just juice and a cracker. Okay? It doesn't have the symbolism. It doesn't have the meaning behind it that it does for a Christ follower. So for the Christ follower, as we consider what we're doing, we consider gratitude, we consider grace, we consider forgiveness, we consider the way that Jesus was generous with us first so that we can then receive the tangible reminder. So for those of us who are Christ followers, what a beautiful, beautiful gift. So I'm going to bless the elements, and then if you would like to receive communion with us, we invite you to do so. Come back to your seat. We're going to sing for a little bit, and I'll make a couple final announcements. Father God, we thank you so much for reminders like this, the parable of the sower, where we see a sower sowing so many seeds and the various soils that it fall on. God, I pray that we would be thankful that when those seeds are falling on the good soil in our life, we can see it. We can celebrate it. God, I pray that as we consider where that's not happening, that we would remember your grace, and through this act of communion and receiving the communion as a church body, that you are reminding us in this very moment of that truth. That this is not a moment to beat ourselves up, but this is a moment to receive the good work, the gospel, the salvation of Jesus. And let us celebrate that well. We thank you for that in Jesus' name. Amen. Please receive the communion elements. Come back to your seats.